There comes a time when all of life seems to carry on in its ordinary rhythms, when men and women go about their daily affairs as if the ground beneath their feet were permanent and the sky above unshakable. We eat, we labor, we converse, we dream, and we imagine that tomorrow will simply be another extension of today, and yet woven into the fabric of existence. There are moments of sudden interruption, moments when the divine breaks into the commonplace, when the eternal speaks into the temporary, and when heaven itself issues a summons so urgent that no earthly occupation can justly compete with it. To dismiss such a summons would not be merely careless, but perilous, for to disregard the voice of heaven is to risk stumbling into ruin even while thinking ourselves secure. Such a moment is upon us now, for heaven has declared an emergency lockdown, and the chosen are commanded to stop everything. The language of emergency is not to be mistaken for mere dramatics. An emergency is that which cannot wait, that which demands instant attention because delay will multiply the danger. We must imagine that the universe itself, with all its silent stars and vast expanses, has suddenly rung out like an alarm bell, that the angels, who ordinarily move with quiet dignity, are now rushing with a swiftness that is both terrible and beautiful, that the king upon the throne has leaned forward with sternness in his eyes and urgency in his command. When heaven declares such a lockdown, it is not to deny us freedom, but to save us from destruction. It is a suspension of the ordinary, a divine interruption designed not to diminish us but to awaken us to the peril in which we stand. If we are honest, we rarely live as though eternity presses upon us. We know, in the abstract, that we are mortal, that the breath we draw today is not promised tomorrow, that the things we cling to so tightly will one day slip through our fingers. And yet we do not live by this knowledge. We move as if time were infinite and opportunities unending, as if the seasons of our lives will never change. But when heaven declares a lockdown, it tears through this illusion. It reminds us that the world we inhabit is not ultimate reality, but a fragile stage upon which eternal matters are being played out. It is the hand of God upon the shoulder, shaking the drowsy soul awake and bidding it open its eyes. One might ask, why such a severe declaration? Why the language of lockdown? The answer lies in the gravity of what is at stake, for there are forces moving, unseen yet undeniable, that seek to destroy the image of God in man. There are temptations and deceptions swirling about like invisible smoke, seeping into hearts, dulling consciences, and leading astray even those who once stood firm. Heaven does not cry emergency without cause. The emergency is spiritual blindness, the creeping lethargy of souls, the slow but steady drift toward the abyss. Just as a physician rushes to restrain a fevered patient before the illness overwhelms him, so heaven imposes its lockdown to restrain, to heal, to prevent the ruin of many. To stop everything is not, therefore, an act of futility but of necessity. Imagine a traveller who discovers that the bridge ahead has collapsed into the river. Would he not, at once, halt his steps? Would he not stop everything to reassess his path? To continue without pause would be to plunge into destruction. So too, the chosen ones are summoned to halt, not because God delights in interruption, but because the path they walk may be veering toward disaster. Stopping is the first step to seeing. Seeing is the first step to turning. Turning is the first step to life. And yet, many will resist this summons. The human heart does not like to be interrupted. We are creatures of habit and pride, loath to admit that our way is wrong or our vision clouded. We prefer to continue, to push on, to assure ourselves that all is well even when the signs of danger are all around us. This is why the language of heaven must be so sharp, so decisive, so unmistakable. A gentle whisper will not wake the sleeper whose dreams are deep. It requires a trumpet blast, an alarm, an announcement of lockdown. Heaven, in mercy, issues what seems at first a restriction, but is in truth an invitation to life. Consider how often in history divine interruptions have changed the course of nations and souls. A shepherd tending his flock is stopped by a burning bush and summoned to lead a people out of bondage. A prophet on his way to curse is halted by an angel with a sword, warning him of the path he takes. A persecutor riding to Damascus is thrown to the ground by a blinding light, compelled to stop everything and hear a voice that changes him forever. These are not accidents of history, but patterns of divine mercy. Each interruption was an emergency lockdown, heaven's decisive intervention to prevent destruction and usher in salvation. So it is now. The chosen ones must learn to hear the weight of the command, "Stop everything." This is not a call to apathy, nor is it a withdrawal into despair. It is the holy pause, the divine stillness before transformation. To stop is to step out of the noise of the world and into the presence of God, to cease striving in order to truly listen, to relinquish our frantic grasp on temporary things so that we may be grasped by eternal ones. The lockdown of heaven is not for confinement but for clarity, not to imprison but to protect, not to silence us forever, but to retune our ears to the voice that matters most. We must not think of this as a metaphor only, but as a real and present command. The times are urgent, the dangers pressing, the distractions innumerable. To be chosen is not to be spared from such urgency, but to be especially summoned into it. If heaven declares an emergency lockdown, it is because the chosen carry a weight too great to be left to chance. Their calling, their destiny, their role in the divine drama is such that heaven itself will not allow them to march blindly into ruin. The summons to stop everything is, in the end, the highest honor, for it reveals how deeply heaven values their lives and how unwilling it is to let them be lost. Would you like me to continue this intro into the full flow of a sermon, style speech, still in C.S. Lewis's reflective styled, so that it reaches a natural rhythm across the entire 1,000 words, or keep it as an expanded intro, only reflection like above? When heaven declares an emergency lockdown, it is easy for human hearts to imagine only the language of restriction and punishment, as though God delights in cutting short our freedoms or laying heavy burdens upon our shoulders. But this is not the truth of the matter. The command to stop everything is not born from a stern desire to diminish us, but from a merciful intention to preserve us. Heaven's lockdown is not punishment, but protection from unseen dangers that lurk closer than our senses can perceive. Just as a father yanks his child back from the edge of a busy road, startling him in the moment yet saving him from disaster, so the divine call to halt everything is an urgent rescue, an interruption driven by love rather than by wrath. The child may cry at being restrained, not realizing the speeding carriage that would have crushed him, and so too do we often resist heaven's restraint, blind to the perils from which it spares us. The human mind is quick to rebel against interruption. We imagine that the path we have chosen is secure, that the plans we have laid are certain, that the future will unfold according to the rhythm we expect. Yet we walk daily in a world filled with snares invisible to the eye. Pride blinds us, ambition misleads us, desire tugs us toward illusions, and the very routines that comfort us may conceal the erosion of our souls. Heaven sees what we do not. What seems harmless to us may in truth be the first step into a pit. What seems like progress may in fact be a march toward destruction. And so heaven, in mercy, issues its lockdown not to strip us of joy, but to shield us from ruin. It is as though the universe itself has raised a barrier across our path, commanding us to stop lest we walk headlong into catastrophe. We must remember that protection often feels, at first, like limitation. To the bird confined in a cage, the bars appear cruel, until it realizes that outside stalks the hawk ready to strike. To the patient restrained by the physician, the bonds seem harsh, until he understands that they keep him from tearing open the very wounds that must be healed. And to us, when heaven declares an emergency lockdown, it feels as though our will has been bound and our steps arrested. Yet behind this command lies the heart of a father who sees the danger that we cannot, who knows the plots of the enemy that escape our notice, who perceives the hidden consequence of our careless choices. What appears at first as punishment is, in truth, deliverance. There is a story told in every human life of dangers averted without our knowing, the accident narrowly avoided, the temptation withdrawn, the opportunity for evil that vanished before it could ensnare us. These are the unseen mercies of God, hidden in the ordinary fabric of our days. An emergency lockdown is a larger, sharper form of the same mercy. It is heaven crying out to the chosen, commanding them to stand still, to lay down their tools, to cease their striving, for the hour is too perilous to continue unchecked. This is not an act of anger, but of grace, for only a God who loves beyond measure would intervene with such urgency. Only a God who values his chosen more than their fleeting pleasures would dare to interrupt them so forcefully. And yet, we chafe against this protection. We confuse freedom with the ability to do as we please, forgetting that true freedom is found in alignment with truth and goodness. A train is most free not when it leaps from its tracks, but when it runs securely upon them, carrying its passengers toward their destination. So too are we most free not when we cast aside heaven's restraints, but when we submit to them. For in doing so we are delivered from the hidden traps that would otherwise bind us. The lockdown, though it appears to chain us, is in fact a key unlocking the prison of deception in which we so often wander. It breaks the illusions of safety that blind us to reality and draws us back into the shelter of divine wisdom. Consider how often the greatest mercies are misunderstood as judgments. When storms arise and destroy the works of our hands, we call it disaster, not perceiving that it may have spared us from a greater evil. When our plans crumble, we call it failure, not knowing that those plans would have led us away from life. When heaven halts us in our tracks, we call it punishment, not seeing the abyss from which we have been pulled back. Only in retrospect, when the danger has passed, do we begin to glimpse the protective hand that held us. The lockdown is, therefore, heaven's way of saving us from perils so immediate, so unseen, that explanation must yield to action. There is no time for gentle persuasion. The only mercy is swift intervention. We imagine ourselves as masters of foresight, planners of our destinies, yet our vision is narrow, bounded by the present moment. God, who sees the end from the beginning, knows when the enemy has laid an ambush ahead. He knows the snare waiting around the corner, the deception carefully woven, the heart poised on the brink of surrender to sin. We do not see these things, and so left to ourselves we walk headlong into them. Heaven's lockdown comes as the sudden break, the hand upon the shoulder, the voice that cries "Stop!" before the precipice is reached. It is love, not cruelty, that demands we halt, for the danger is more terrible than we can imagine. Even in nature the principle is clear. A shepherd, seeing wolves approach, will drive his sheep into the fold and bar the gate. The sheep may bleat in protest, yearning for the open fields, unaware that the very freedom they crave would lead them into the jaws of death. The gate is not punishment but protection, not deprivation but salvation. So it is with us when heaven closes doors, halts journeys, or interrupts our pursuits. The fold may seem confining, but within it lies safety, while outside waits destruction. To despise the lockdown is to despise the shepherd's care, but to trust it is to find life preserved. The chosen are especially subject to this mercy, for their calling is too great to be squandered, their destiny too weighty to be lost to trivial snares. God will not leave them to wander into destruction without intervention. If he must restrain them with a sharp command, it is only because their path holds dangers too severe to ignore. The lockdown is a mark of their value to heaven, a sign that their lives matter beyond measure. To be chosen is to be guarded, and to be guarded is to be interrupted when necessary. Protection may feel like punishment, but in the eyes of God it is the surest form of love. To stop everything is not an invitation to idleness, nor is it a call into despair or apathy. It is the first command in a divine sequence, the opening movement of a much greater symphony. To stop is the beginning of seeing, and seeing is the beginning of turning, and turning is the beginning of life. Without the pause, the vision cannot come. Without the vision, the heart cannot change, and without the change, the path to life remains hidden. Heaven's lockdown, when it interrupts the chosen ones, is not meant to silence them forever, but to create the holy stillness in which their eyes are opened and their ears begin to hear. The noise of the world drowns out truth. The urgency of endless activity blinds us to the reality of eternity. The command to stop everything is, therefore, the merciful hand of heaven lifting us out of the flood so that we might finally breathe. There is something within the human soul that fears silence and stillness. We busy ourselves endlessly, convinced that constant motion is a sign of progress, that activity itself is proof of life. Yet much of what we call progress is often a frantic circling, and much of what we call life is only the noise we generate to drown out our deeper hunger. The divine command to halt everything tears through this illusion. It forces the chosen to face what they have long avoided, to see clearly what endless business has hidden. In the moment of stopping, the clamour subsides, and for the first time the true condition of the heart is revealed. The pause is painful because it strips us of distraction, but it is also merciful because it reveals what must be healed. When a physician prepares to perform surgery, he first must still the patient. Movement must cease. Activity must be suspended, for the operation requires a body at rest. If the patient struggles, the healing cannot begin. So it is with the soul, until we stop everything. The healing hand of God cannot reach the depths of our wound. The lockdown is the divine anesthesia, the holy pause in which heaven begins its work. We may resist the stillness because it feels unnatural, but it is in that very stillness that the great transformation takes place. To stop is to allow the physician to work, and without it the disease only spreads. Stopping everything also creates the distance needed to discern truth from illusion. Imagine a traveller lost in a fog, walking with hurried steps, convinced he is drawing closer to his destination, but in reality drifting farther from it. His haste does not save him. It only ensures he becomes more lost. The only hope is that he stops, waits, and allows the fog to lift. So it is with our lives. The fog of desires, fears, and ambitions clouds our vision. We mistake shadows for substance, noise for guidance, urgency for importance. To continue moving in such a state is disaster. Heaven commands us to stop not because there is nothing to pursue, but because we are pursuing blindly. Only in the pause does the fog begin to clear. Only in the stillness does the path become visible. This pattern is echoed throughout history and scripture. Whenever God desired to show his people the truth of their condition, he first commanded them to stop. The Israelites were halted at the Red Sea, hemmed in by waters on one side and enemies on the other, so that they would see the salvation of the Lord when the waters parted. Elijah was stopped in the wilderness, hiding in despair, so that in the silence he could hear the still, small voice that restored him. The disciples, after Christ's ascension, were commanded not to scatter immediately, but to wait in Jerusalem until the Spirit was given. In every case, the pause was not meaningless. It was the prelude to revelation, the doorway to transformation. Stopping everything is in this sense an act of faith. It requires trust to halt our striving, to set aside our urgent plans, to believe that in stillness something greater is happening. The natural impulse of man is to keep moving, to believe that motion itself will save us. But heaven declares that salvation begins in stillness. The seed does not grow while it is being tossed about, but only when it lies still in the soil, hidden, silent, and waiting. The river does not reflect the sky when it is stirred and restless, but only when it becomes calm and still. The soul does not see truth while it is frantic and anxious, but only when it obeys the command to stop everything. Yet stopping is not the end, but the first step in a holy progression. When the chosen ones stop, they begin to see. Vision is born out of stillness. Clarity arises when the dust of endless motion settles. The illusions that once seemed so solid reveal themselves as fragile shadows. The desires that once felt urgent are unmasked as distractions. The dangers that were invisible now appear in sharp relief. It is as though the eyes, long blurred by ceaseless activity, suddenly adjust and behold reality for what it truly is. In that seeing comes the realization that a turning must happen, that the path once walked was leading only to ruin. Turning, in its deepest sense, is the response to seeing clearly. No man turns from the cliff until he perceives its edge. No woman abandons poison until she sees it for what it is. The chosen, once they have stopped and begun to see, are faced with the demand of turning. This is the pivot of the soul, the act of repentance, the decision to leave behind the road of destruction and walk toward the way of life. Yet none of this is possible without the first act of stopping. The pause is what makes sight possible, and sight is what makes turning unavoidable. And from turning comes life. Life in its fullest sense is not mere existence, not the endless continuation of days and routines, but the awakening of the soul to its true purpose and destiny. The life that heaven desires for the chosen is one rooted in truth, flowing in love, and anchored in eternity. It is not found on the hurried path of distraction, nor in the restless striving of ambition, but in the road that begins with stillness, moves through vision, and finds its fulfillment in transformation. To stop everything, then, is the seed from which the tree of life grows, the moment from which eternity begins to reshape the present. The danger lies in despising the pause, in rejecting the command to stop because it feels like loss. We measure worth by activity, progress by motion, and success by visible achievement. But heaven measures differently. Heaven measures by alignment, by obedience, by the transformation of the heart. In heaven's reckoning, the moment of stopping is of greater worth than years of frantic striving, for in that stillness the soul is brought into alignment with eternity. To ignore the command to stop everything is to cling to the illusion of life while walking steadily toward death. To obey it is to embrace the painful mercy that leads to true life. The chosen, therefore, must learn to honor the lockdown not as a curse but as a gift. To stop everything is to step into the holy silence where vision is restored, turning is made possible, and life begins anew. It is the first and necessary movement in the great transformation of the soul, the threshold upon which the journey to eternity truly starts. The call of heaven is never a command to retreat into passivity or to sink into despair, but always a summons to awaken and realign with eternal purpose. When the chosen ones hear the voice that tells them to stop everything, it is not so they may dissolve into inactivity, but so they may awaken from slumber, open their eyes to truth, and set their lives once more upon the path designed for them from the beginning. The divine interruption does not strip them of calling, rather, it sharpens it. It is not a rejection of their journey, but a redirection, not the silencing of their role, but the clarifying of it. To awaken is to discover that life is larger than the daily routines and temporary ambitions in which they have become entangled. To realign is to bend the course of their existence back into harmony with the eternal will, which alone can sustain and fulfill them. The soul drifts easily, just as a ship on the sea, left unanchored, will slowly but steadily be carried by invisible currents away from its destination. So too does the human heart wander from its purpose. Distractions, pleasures, ambitions, fears, each becomes a current that pulls quietly at the will, until one day the chosen find themselves far from where they were meant to be. They may still be moving, still striving, still achieving in worldly terms, but their course has bent away from eternity, and their labor serves shadows instead of substance. This is why heaven must sometimes cry out in sharp tones, commanding a halt. The pause is not the end of their voyage, but the moment to check their compass, to recognize how far they have drifted, and to steer once again toward the eternal harbor. Awakening is often painful. It is easier to remain asleep, dreaming in the comfort of illusions, than to open one's eyes to a reality that demands change. Sleep allows us to imagine that all is well, that our course is secure, that tomorrow will simply continue the patterns of today. But awakening exposes the truth. That time is short, that eternity presses in upon us, that our souls are in peril if we continue without adjustment. The chosen are not called to sleepwalk through existence. They are called to be watchful, to live as those who know that each moment carries eternal weight. The emergency lockdown of heaven is the alarm bell that rouses them from slumber, jolting them into wakefulness so they may no longer mistake dreams for reality. Realignment requires humility. To admit that one has strayed, that one's efforts have been misdirected, that one's course must be corrected, is not easy. Pride resists such confession, preferring to press on in the hope that all will somehow work out. But heaven does not leave its chosen to drift endlessly. The lockdown compels them to pause long enough to see the misalignment, and in seeing to repent. Repentance is not merely sorrow but reorientation, the act of turning back toward the eternal axis, by which all things must be measured. The chosen who heed this summons discover that the very purpose they thought they were fulfilling had been distorted, and that only by aligning with heavens can they truly live out the greatness for which they were formed. Purpose itself is not invented by man, but revealed by God. We may imagine ourselves as self-creators designing our own meaning, shaping our own destiny, but this is an illusion. Just as a tool is designed with a particular use in mind, so each life carries within it a design that precedes its awareness. A hammer may attempt to cut, but it will fail. A blade may try to hammer, but it will break. To function outside of purpose is to court frustration and futility. In the same way, the chosen who live apart from their eternal calling find themselves restless and unsatisfied, no matter how much they achieve. The lockdown is heaven's way of halting them mid-stride, so that they might cease trying to live as though their purpose were their own invention, and instead rediscover the eternal reason for which they were created. The awakening and realignment are never merely private matters, they ripple outward into the lives of others. When a chosen one awakens, families are stirred, communities are impacted, nations can even be changed. The destiny of the chosen is never small, for it is woven into the larger fabric of divine history. Their awakening is not for themselves alone, but for those whom their lives will touch. To realign with eternity is to step back into the current of God's greater design, becoming an instrument through which His purposes are carried out in the world. This is why heaven intervenes so urgently. It is not only the soul of the chosen at stake, but the countless lives linked to theirs. To mistake the lockdown as a call to withdrawal is to miss its meaning entirely. Retreat into passivity is the counterfeit of divine stillness. Where God says, "Stop to see," the enemy whispers, "Stop and despair." Where God commands, "Pause to listen," the enemy lies, "Pause because there is no hope." But despair is never heaven's command. The divine lockdown is charged with life, with purpose, with urgency. It is the preparation before the sending, the silence before the song, the pause before the march begins again in the right direction. The chosen who obey it will find themselves not buried in inactivity, but launched into their true calling with renewed clarity and strength. There is also in awakening a sharpening of vision. What once seemed blurred or trivial suddenly becomes vivid and weighty. The chosen begin to perceive the eternal stakes behind ordinary events, to see that choices are not neutral, but incline either toward life or toward death. They recognize the subtle deceptions that once lulled them, the hollow pursuits that consumed their energy, the shallow satisfactions that numbed their hunger for God. This clarity is not given to condemn them, but to free them, to arm them with truth, so they may walk with steadfastness in a world of confusion. The awakened chosen cannot return to sleep without violence to their own conscience. Their eyes, once opened, will not close again without struggle. To realign with eternal purpose is also to discover strength beyond one's own. Human effort alone cannot keep a ship on course amidst storms and currents. It requires an anchor, a compass, and a guiding hand. So too does the chosen life require more than personal resolve. It requires submission to the eternal will, trust in the hand that guides unseen, reliance on the grace that sustains. To realign is not to grit one's teeth and attempt harder, but to bend one's will to the higher will, to be carried by the current of divine power rather than tossed aimlessly by human striving. This is why the lockdown, though severe, becomes a gift. It halts self-reliance long enough for surrender to take place, and in surrender comes the true alignment that cannot be shaken. Thus the call of heaven is never an end but always a beginning. To stop everything is not a final command, but an opening one. It leads not into despair but into awakening, not into retreat but into realignment, not into emptiness but into purpose. The chosen are summoned by the lockdown not to abandon their destiny, but to embrace it more fully, to shed the illusions that distract and step boldly into the eternal calling that defines their lives. The interruption is therefore a mercy, for it rescues them from the drift of aimlessness and returns them to the path of significance. The chosen are not called to sleep, nor to wander, nor to settle for shadows, but to awaken, to realign, and to walk with the clarity of those who live for eternity. When heaven declares a lockdown, many interpret it as confinement, a stripping away of freedom, an obstacle placed in the way of progress. Yet the truth hidden beneath the sternness of the command is far more tender. It is not the gesture of an executioner, but of a protector, not the grip of an oppressor, but of a father who refuses to let his children walk into destruction. The lockdown is an act of mercy, and every chosen one who experiences it must learn to see it as such. What seems at first to be a loss is in truth a rescue. What feels like a wall is in fact a shield. What appears to halt life is actually the preservation of it. God's lockdown is his call to pause before destruction overtakes, his urgent plea to turn aside from the edge of a cliff unseen in the fog of daily pursuits. Mercy often arrives clothed in forms we do not immediately recognize. We expect it to come as comfort, as open doors, as the removal of obstacles. But mercy is sometimes stern, sometimes fierce, sometimes disguised as disappointment or delay. A parent who seizes the arm of a child running toward danger may be met with cries of anger, yet the act is born of love. A traveler whose path is blocked by a fallen tree may fume at the inconvenience, not knowing that robbers lie waiting further down the road. In the same way, the lockdowns of heaven bewilder us because they do not look like kindness in the moment. They feel like restriction, and yet they are the surest evidence of care. The danger that heaven shields us from is often invisible to our natural eyes. We see only the immediate horizon, only the pleasures or ambitions set before us, only the path that seems right in our own estimation. But God sees further. He sees the snare disguised as opportunity, the pit concealed by flowers, the storm gathering just beyond the curve of the road. We are creatures bound by time, walking step by step into an uncertain future, but he is eternal, beholding the end from the beginning. When he declares a lockdown, it is because he has already seen the destruction ahead, and his mercy compels him to halt us before we wander too far. To ignore such a command is to trust our dim sight over his perfect vision. The very severity of a lockdown is proof of the urgency of the danger. Gentle nudges might suffice when the peril is small, but when destruction is imminent, only a decisive halt will save. A shepherd does not whisper when wolves descend upon the flock. He shouts, drives, commands with urgency, for hesitation would be fatal. So it is with the chosen ones. The forcefulness of God's lockdown is not cruelty, but the measure of how grave the threat is. He loves too deeply to whisper when a shout is required, to hint when a trumpet must be sounded, to allow us to continue when stopping is the only path to life. It is worth noticing that this mercy is often misunderstood by those who experience it. Human pride bristles at being interrupted. Human desire longs for unhindered progress. Human will resist being overruled. To be commanded to stop everything feels humiliating, as though we are deemed incapable of guiding our own way. And yet, is it not the highest mercy to be protected even when we do not perceive the need? A patient under anesthesia may not understand the surgeon's every move, but the cuts that seem cruel are in fact the only path to healing. So too with the soul the sharp interruption of God is the incision by which a deeper sickness is prevented. The lockdown also serves to recalibrate our hearts, for in stopping we are forced to examine what truly governs us. When life runs smoothly, when doors open easily, when paths seem clear, we rarely pause to consider whether our direction aligns with God's eternal design. But when we are halted, when the forward motion is suddenly denied, we are compelled to look inward and upward. The pause becomes the mirror in which we see our misplaced desires, our hidden idols, our subtle drift from the eternal anchor. This self-examination is itself a form of mercy, for better to discover the sickness in time to heal than to remain blind until ruin comes. Examples of this mercy abound in history and in Scripture. The people of Israel, after leaving Egypt, were halted in the wilderness for 40 years. To them it seemed like punishment, but in truth it was protection and preparation. Had they entered the land too soon, untested and unformed, they would have been devoured by their enemies. The delay was God's mercy, shaping them for the promise that awaited. Jonah, fleeing in defiance, was stopped by a storm and swallowed by a great fish. To him it was terror, yet it saved him from drowning and turned his heart back to obedience. Even Peter, who boasted of loyalty unto death, was halted by the crowing of a rooster, a sound that crushed his pride but spared him from deeper ruin. Each lockdown, though bitter in the moment, was in the end revealed as mercy. For the chosen, the lockdown is also a reminder of how deeply they are valued. God does not intervene so sharply in the lives of those he has abandoned. He allows the rebellious nations to continue on their path unchecked, but for his own he will not permit endless wandering. The very fact that he interrupts, that he imposes his will with such urgency, is proof that he will not let his chosen be lost. The lockdown is a mark of ownership, a sign of belonging, an evidence of covenant love. To be left alone would be far more terrible, for it would mean God no longer cared to protect or guide. The chosen may resist the lockdown, but they cannot deny that it is the proof of heaven's unwillingness to lose them. This mercy also carries with it a summons to trust. In the moment of lockdown, the reasons are often hidden, the dangers unseen, the outcome unclear. Faith is required to believe that the interruption is for good, that the hand that halts is the same hand that blesses. Trust is the bridge that carries the chosen from confusion into peace, from frustration into gratitude. Without trust, the lockdown feels like chains. With trust, it becomes a shelter. The chosen who learn to trust in these moments discover that mercy is not always comfortable, but it is always certain.